Would you like to make your very own snow globe? Then keep on watching. This snow globe would be a great project you could do on Christmas with your family. This could even turn into a tradition. Let's get to it. Okay, you guys, I'm so excited to walk you through making this amazing snow globe. I've always wanted to make it, and I figured why not make it now. So, first of all, break a piece off of your foam brush and use the light blue and white paint to create clouds on your snow globe. You can place them wherever you want, however you want. Just make sure you love it. Keep on watching. With a thin paintbrush, use the brown paint to create 5 trees. If you want to create more, you can. Okay, you guys, I hope you are following along so far, and just know that when you do this project, you have to have fun with it, play your music, vibe, and have fun. So, on to the next part of the project, we will be using the foam to create the snow effect on the bottom of the globe. Use the white paint to do this. And following, we will be using the thin paintbrush to apply glue to the floor and in between the branches of the tree. Then apply the glitter, and you want to also do this with the clouds as well.
We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Good tidings we bring to you and your kin. Good tidings for Christmas and a Happy
Okay, you guys, I hope you are vibing to the Christmas tunes. And to follow through with the next part of the project, we will be opening the globe and taking the suction piece out so we can apply our Santa, our gifts, and the foam snow.
Oh, bring us a figgy pudding. Oh, bring us a figgy pudding. Oh, bring us a figgy pudding and a cup of good cheer. We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. We won't go until we get some. So bring some out here. Good tidings we bring to you and your kin. Good tidings for Christmas and a Happy New Year. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you
Okay, we are getting close to the end of our project, and right now we need to apply 2 teaspoons of glycerin to the globe. And I poured a little bit of water first to mix the glitter so that it doesn't clump up on you. So you can do that. If you choose not to, that's fine. Then after you mix a little bit of the glitter, then you can pour the rest of the water in, and make sure you don't pour too much water, because when you put the Santa into it, it's gonna overflow, and that kind of happened to me. But keep on watching. Just a little FYI, you might want to spray the snow globe with a protective gloss so that when you put the Santa in it and the water falls over it, if it does, it did for me, it will be protected and would not wash away, because that's kind of what happened to me. I love the way my snow globe is coming out. I hope you enjoy so far. And now we will be gluing the 2-inch round foam to the bottom of the snow globe, followed by applying the ribbon and then the bow tie.
Dashing through the snow in a one-horse open sleigh, o'er the fields we go, laughing all the way. Bells on bobtail ring, making spirits bright. What fun it is to ride and sing a sleighing song tonight. Oh, jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open sleigh. Hey, jingle bells, jingle all the way. Oh, what fun it is to ride in a one-horse open sleigh. A day or two ago, I thought I'd take a ride, and soon Miss Fanny Bright was seated by my side. The horse was lean and lame, misfortune seemed his lot. He got into a drifted bank and then we got upset. The horse was
This snow globe was so much fun to make. I hope you enjoyed this video and will try this on Christmas. Like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Comment below and tell me what you think. See you soon.